Sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome everyone to Pod and Man at Yale. I'm Ari Schaefer, the host, Communications Director here at the Buckley Institute. It's my pleasure to have with us today, returning to the podcast, Will Barbee, a junior.
Thanks, Ari.
And for the first time, we have David Fleming, also a junior.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
And Josh Danziger, a freshman.
Hi, Ari. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Great having you guys on. Thanks for joining. So today we're going to talk about the proposed reinvigoration, or recreation of the police oversight panel at Yale. At the end of January, the Yale College Council passed a resolution calling for the creation of an advisory board overseeing the Yale Police Department. The board would include 2 undergrads, 2 grad students, and 5 faculty members. It would have the power to, quote, review YPD surveillance practices, use of force policies, and collaborations with external agencies. The resolution also called for banning, quote-unquote, excessive surveillance from using drones to monitoring social media. It also called for disclosing any collaboration with federal and state agencies to the Oversight Board in advance for review. There are a few other things in there as well. I encourage you to look it up on the YCC website. So Will and David here are YCC senators. David voted against it. Will abstained. David, why don't you start us off? What were you thinking? What was the context of the resolution? What was your thinking about it? Why'd you ultimately vote against it?
Yeah, happy to discuss. Well, I think the context of the resolution is that people were pretty frustrated with the student protesting situation. And I think a lot of people on YCC and much of the student body was looking for a little bit more regulation of the police department so that there wasn't use of excessive force, because then they had an independent party do some reports of some of the police on campus, and they declared that there was some use of excessive force. And then I think there were a lot of students that were quite upset with that. But from my standpoint, a lot of the proposals didn't make sense. One of them was involving reduction of what they could deem to be excessive militarization. And I think drones are necessary. It's important that we can monitor student swipes, and a lot of the things baked into the proposal are things we need. I think it's important to keep our students safe on campus, and especially in New Haven, which can be at times a dangerous city. So I think some of these proposals didn't make sense. And then the other thing that was included was the advisory board, including a couple undergraduate students. And one of the necessities of any police force, I believe, is having some independence and autonomy in their operations. And I was afraid that by having some undergraduates on this advisory board, that would be reduced to some degree. And especially that the undergraduate students might not have some of the training and experience in policing that, for example, the department does.
How about you, Will? You abstained. What were your thoughts on this?
Sure. So, I usually approach most of the bills that come before us in YCC with the mindset of, do I have enough information to develop an opinion on the subject? I think that oftentimes I find myself not feeling as though I have enough information to make to develop an educated opinion about a subject that comes before us. Frankly, because a lot of the proposals that come up are very much, sort of broad ideas that Yale students may want the administration to implement, but it's very important to understand that the Yale College Council's procedures are not binding, right? Most of them are not binding. Usually the only things that are binding are things that relate to our own personal budget, which is usually about approximately $1 million per year. But everything else is mainly just advocacy work from either senators or the YCC president and vice president with the administration. So for
advocacy
meaning the president and the vice president have meetings very often with the Yale College Dean's office, Pericles Lewis and others in the Dean's office, and they work with them on a regular basis and say, the Yale College Council has passed these 3 proposals. We would like for the administration to make these a priority in the next year. And then it's up to the discretion of Dean Lewis and, to a certain extent, President McInnes to make the decision about, if something gets picked up, if something is developed eventually, but it's not a binding or powerful, actual policy, let's say. So when it comes down to like me basically signing off on something, I do feel often as though I need to be able to have an educated opinion about something. I thought that, a lot of the concerns perhaps that were brought up in this proposal were well-founded in the sense that I don't think that in any campus situation, any student should feel pressured or feel threatened by the police, especially in matters of free speech, right? That's at the Buckley Institute. We're very supportive of free speech. If anything, it's our mission. And so I would never want any student to feel as though, the police were unfairly targeting them for their speech. And I could easily imagine it being a conservative student myself, seeing on the other side of that spectrum where, perhaps if a cause that I was in support of had some sort of protest or rally that was then, actively targeted by the police, it would be a problem for me. But ultimately, I didn't agree with all of the things that were in the proposal, so I chose to abstain from the measure.
So, David, Will, before we bring Josh in, talk about the broader campus discussion, what was the discussion within the YCC like about this resolution? Was there debate? Was there back and forth?
Yeah, there was some back and forth. A number of students were chiming in on the pro side. I think there were 18 students of the 27 senators or so in attendance that voted for this measure. There was some back and forth, and I think much of the discussion on why perhaps this isn't the best solution is stemming from what Will has mentioned is the goal of the police is to keep the students safe. And I don't think we had enough information to know whether all of these measures were really appropriate at the time.
Yeah, I'll just add to that and say that I would say that, obviously the proposal passed, so it had that majority of people within the room to support it. But, I will say that there were definitely some concerns raised over student safety, granting students some sort of ability or oversight of the police. Many were worried that that could lead to a decrease in student safety and more so a decrease in police efficiency, right? And the fact that if you have to put something through some sort of bureaucracy of students, when these decisions have to be made, it could lead to an environment where the police are not actually as necessarily invested, or they don't have the capabilities, the full extent of their capabilities to really, keep students safe and pursue their ends. So
I want to bring Josh in here. You wrote an op-ed in the YDN opposing the police oversight board or criticizing it. I don't know how you would want to characterize that. The title was "Keep Student Politics Out of Policing." You're not on the YCC, the Yale College Council yourself. So what was the discussion you heard with your friends around campus, and how did that feed into your decision to speak out?
Sure. I want to clarify, I don't think I'm opposed to a police advisory board. I'm opposed to the police advisory board that was proposed and passed in this YCC referendum. So Yale College has previously had a number of iterations of police advisory board going back to perhaps as early as 1971. The role of prior boards was to recommend to the police department disciplinary action for certain police officers who may have overstepped their bounds. In 2020, the board was revived amidst the George Floyd protests around the country that was going on. And from 2020 to 2024, the board became an important forum for, I believe it was one undergraduate, a couple graduate students, faculty, and then the police department to have discussions about the most productive way the Yale Police Department could act and interact with the community. The Yale College Dean, Pericles Lewis, gave an interview a couple months ago where he described the role of the former board and said that they helped solidify the YPD's mission Following 2020, the YPD started wearing different uniforms. Yale security started wearing different uniforms. These were some of the changes made from the former board. So it was really a positive, from my understanding, a positive environment from which to make change. In 2024, with the protests that were going on campus, the Yale Police Department phased out the board for unknown reasons. Perhaps one reason was that the single undergraduate representative to the board was arrested twice and charged with trespassing. So maybe that that
probably didn't help.
It hurt the trust that the police department had with the members of the board if they were arresting their own members. But I think it can be very productive if there is a board to communicate between the YPD and the students. That being said, that is not what the YCC resolution is proposing. The YCC resolution, has a number of solutions, but when it establishes the board, it says the board will have access to records of YPD surveillance. Students and faculty shouldn't have access to police surveillance, right? There's a number of concerns regarding that. It says that any non-emergency collaboration between the YPD and federal and state agencies, including the FBI and the Connecticut Intelligence Center, should be approved by the Student Oversight Board. Students shouldn't have the authority to approve police department action and approve police department collaboration. Students are not qualified. That didn't make sense to me.
So one of the things you mentioned, which stood out to me in your op-ed, was that the last time, or when they had this police oversight board, and it kind of was shut down during the protests last year, the one student who was on the board, one student representative, ended up getting arrested for trespassing. Twice. Not just once, but twice. So I think a lot of people who hear about these police oversight boards, they exist at the municipal, local level. Also, I think they're probably federal police, use of force boards and things like that who do similar work. The concern they have is that this is, while there are legitimate concerns that people raised, will raise, David quoted about, the use of force and civilian oversight of that and student oversight about that. The concern is that this just ends up being a platform for students or people who want to commit crimes to make it harder for police to enforce that. Is that a concern that you guys had looking at this newly reincarnated board?
I would say it's certainly at the back of the mind of many students, especially those who were perhaps in the room at the time that this bill was proposed, that, we're in kind of a situation, especially in New Haven, which, has a bit of a reputation for, not necessarily being the safest city. People do have these concerns about crime, and they do have these concerns about public safety, especially coming from the students. And so I would say that, I think many people were skeptical of the proposal, chiefly on the grounds that it would be prohibiting the police from doing their job. Not necessarily that it would make it easier for people to commit crimes, but just that it would prevent the police from really, pursuing things to the full extent that they should be able to pursue them to.
David?
I agree. And there was some discussion of necessary approval from the oversight board in order for police to act as well. And that was a little concerning to me because I think police need their space to operate. I agree with what Josh said about the necessity of bounds on the police, and I think an oversight board is helpful, but I don't think it should be preventing the police from taking proper measure in a lot of cases.
Josh, or I guess this is really a question to all of you. Do you guys feel safe in New Haven generally? I don't mean like, walk to campus, you're not necessarily worried about getting mugged, but late at night, coming home with friends from a party, from a restaurant, do you guys feel safe here?
I think I do feel safe. I feel safe walking back late at night. I feel safe around my dorm. I think that's for a number of reasons, particularly the blue light system. Particularly, I see the presence of Yale security around campus, and I do frequently see the presence of the Yale Police Department. That requires their presence. And I think the student population recognizes the importance of both the Yale security force and the Yale Police Department in helping them feel safe. but that requires the continued presence. And that would be my expectation for the university.
I agree. Generally, I feel quite safe on campus and agree that it requires those measures to continue to feel safe.
Yeah. I would just say that I was born in New York City, and so I have you could say some street smarts in that sense, relating to like how to, just be alert in a city environment. But I could understand how, perhaps some students who say grew up in the suburbs or grew up in cities where there isn't as high levels of crime could come to New Haven and perhaps, walk into a situation that they weren't expecting. So I do think that it's something that students should be prepared for and ready to handle. But I think that the presence of the Yale Police Department and Yale Public Safety does a very excellent job with that.
So when Josh was talking before, he talked about, the timing of the previous iterations of the Oversight Board. He talked about, 2020 as kind of being a landmark year for the country, really, in how we interact with the police and police reform, and namely the Fund the Police movement really got legs. I didn't think it preexisted that, but that's when it surged. What we saw in a lot of cities, the outcome of that was less safe cities, an increase in crime, as in places where they did defund the police. Is that a concern here? Are you guys concerned about that? Is that dynamic something that's on your minds as you think through this issue?
I would say that it seems to me as though Yale and New Haven more broadly is interested in maintaining a strong police presence. I know that I believe it was in the last year, the mayor's office, in their budgets, they basically raised the starting salary for new police officers in an attempt to get more police to join the force in New Haven. I know that there has been some controversy in the past regarding the Yale Police Department, and I believe every year during Bulldog Days, the pre-freshman recruitment season, the Yale Police usually host some sort of event to basically attempt to renegotiate a contract. This is all sort of just information that I see. I don't know the specifics of it. But I don't necessarily think that we're at risk of, completely doing a nosedive in terms of public safety. But I do think it's important to keep it on our minds and, always make sure that we're giving them the adequate resources they need to keep us safe.
How about you, David? Are you worried that this could be like the beginning, or is this some kind of the vestiges of a defund the Yale police movement?
Personally, I don't think so. I agree with what Will said and the importance of being continuously aware of this, but it's not a strong concern of mine at the moment.
How about you, Josh? You're not elected representative here. Representative of the people, if you will.
Sure, and a representative of myself, of course. I write opinion pieces for the Yale Daily News. I wrote a piece about this specific resolution, criticizing the proposed board and proposing a more limited board to perhaps implement community policing policies and strengthen the relationship between the student body and the police department. And I got a lot of positive feedback. Students, I think, recognize that the campus needs police and New Haven needs police, and that it's important to have a positive relationship with the department. But I also think a large number of students struggled with how the campus protests were handled last year, and it was hard to see their friends perhaps be arrested. For a lot of students, they felt that was an overstep. So I really think it is a back and forth. On one hand, they recognize the necessity of the police. On the other hand, they don't want oversight. But I don't expect the student body to continue advocating for a total defunding of the Yale Police Department. I don't, honestly, a year after the protest, I don't think it's on the mind of most students.
So, Josh, I want to ask you guys, Josh and David, you guys expressed, and I will to a lesser extent, I guess, sympathy to the concerns mixed, I guess, overbalanced by concerns about how this board would actually function. So what is a good way to balance the desire to not be over-surveilled, I guess, by the Yale Police Department, or not have the Yale Police Department overstep, while also ensuring they can do their jobs and keep campus safe?
Well, I think it's similar to what Josh mentioned in that I agree there should be an oversight board. and think that it didn't work great to have student representatives in the past. Not to say it can't in the future, but I think they should be erring more towards faculty representatives on that board.
I think oversight board is the wrong word. Students, in my mind, should not have oversight over police. Students and graduate students and faculty are not law enforcement. They have not been trained in protecting civilian populations. They shouldn't have oversight over police matters. I think it should be a cooperation board, an advisory board. And I think the language does matter. Because if you're a police department and you're a police officer in the Yale Police Department and you feel that there's oversight over you from a student, it creates a difficult dynamic. So I think it's really a kind of organization board. I don't know what it needs to be, but that focuses on students actually speaking to police officers, knowing who the police officers are, communicating their concerns, humanizing them. I think that's how you overcome a lot of those difficulties. The other side of that relationship is sometimes the police officers have to do things that are hard. There was an article in the YDN that discussed the YCC resolution and talked about about a statement made by a YPD police officer last year who had previously known the single undergraduate representative on the police advisory board and then went on to arrest that representative twice. So and the police officer said that was a very difficult thing to do, to know somebody, to have spoken to somebody, to know that sometimes that person had very good intentions, but to then have to arrest them was a very hard relationship to navigate. And I think the best way to move through those difficult situations is not by isolating the YPD, acting like students have authority over the YPD, but it's building stronger relationships with officers and with the department.
So, Will, I'm going to pull you back into this one. Josh made an interesting point. He distinguished between oversight and, I guess, some kind of community relations board. What do you think about that split and how it applies to this particular vote? Do you sympathize with? Do you agree with Josh's perspective? Do you think some oversight is more valuable?
Well, I think that's certainly reasonable. I think that any endeavor that has to do with something like public safety or any sort of public position that is meant for some sort of purpose for the people, right? There obviously needs to be communication between the two so that it's not just, we see officers as some aloof individuals who are, so far above us that we can't really even connect with them, right? It's obviously they're people too, and they're people doing a job that's important for your life. While I certainly think that there is a time and a place for, perhaps real serious measures to take into effect, right? Especially if there are instances of, potential wrongdoing or potential excessive force, whatever it might be, in the police departments. I do generally think that, having people just kind of talk with one another in a communal way is really the best way to, maintain community standards, maintain order in society.
So one of the effects of the defund the police movement was police holding back. I was living in Georgia at the time, and this was a phenomenon that they dealt with where the Atlanta police felt uncomfortable doing the kind of things that they needed to do before. And Josh, I think, touched on this a little bit. I'm wondering, are you guys concerned that that an oversight board like this might create a similar phenomenon at Yale, where Yale police might see the relationship as a little more antagonistic and hold back, or do you think this will make no difference in that regard?
Well, David? I hope, and thank you, Josh. I agree with your language, more of an advisory board or collaboration more than oversight. And I think given that relationship is a healthy one, I don't foresee any concern.
Well,
yeah, I would second that. I think that the police, I kind of made this comment last year during the whole campus protest when, a lot of people really were complaining about the way that the police handled the situation. But in my mind, I was like, there is almost zero incentive for any of these police officers to act wildly out of line, right? Like to have any sort of instance of real abuse I found it very difficult to believe. that there would be serious wrongdoing from the police, from the Yale Police Department specifically, for protesters who were, around campus for, at least 2 weeks, who had, potential leniencies and things like that in the way that they were treated and whatnot. So, I particularly think that there's not too much of a worry that the police will be overly restrained. If anything, I think that, with greater kind of communication between the police, it'll make matters much easier to handle.
So this obviously, the resolution got voted and it got passed overwhelmingly. It was like 18-5 was the result. I mean, most, to be totally transparent, most votes in the Yale College Council are unanimous, or, at most you get like 4 or 5 people who vote against.
And it's usually David and I.
So why do you think it is that there was so much support for something like this, despite this, notwithstanding the concerns all three of you have raised? And I'm curious both from the senator's perspective and from Josh's perspective. Josh, you want to start us off?
Sure. This is a progressive campus. We can't forget that. And we can't forget that everybody, whether you're a progressive, a moderate, a conservative, had friends who were involved with the protest last year. And everybody heard about people that they knew or knew of or heard their name who were arrested. And those dynamics, I think, for a lot of students were very difficult. It was difficult to see students being arrested by what seemed to be by their university at the instruction of their university. And I think a lot of students, because of that, blamed the Yale Police Department and were willing to restrict the powers of the Yale Police Department with this type of oversight board.
David?
Yeah, I agree. This is certainly a progressive campus, and I think there's, for whatever reason, a tendency in YCC for people to vote together, typically yes, on proposals. So why that is, I can't say exactly, though I think that certainly played a role in the overwhelming approval of this proposal.
Meaning just like a inherent inertia towards voting together?
Correct. I believe there's, I believe there's some sort of cultural reason, or people tend to sort of vote together on these measures. I think that's the culture instilled in YCC, is people vote yes on things. I was advised of this from a prior senator who had served last year, and he told me that people tend to vote yes on things, but don't be afraid to be the 1 or 2 no's. And I think there is some fear in people of being one of the only people to vote no as well, and that could certainly play a role in the approval here.
You will. Why do you think it was overwhelmingly in favor of something like this? And do you think there's an alternate Yale or an alternate universe of Yale that might think differently about this issue?
So I think that the point that Josh made was very important regarding last spring's protests, because it has seemed to me that in this last fall, as we've kind of done the autopsy on what happened last spring, we can see that whenever those protests are brought up again, or whenever that memory is brought up again, it tends to be good fuel for people to, support some sort of cause, or, get behind something that they think will really kind of carry on the legacy of those protests without actually, doing the same things that they did last spring, because we're not in a position to be able to do that now. So you saw that with the referendum that was passed in the fall, which was, calling on Yale to divest from its weapons investments. And you see that here too, where, the memory, what people are referring to when they're talking about this police advisory board, it's obviously trying to recall what happened last spring, and so people are automatically more in favor of it, right? They see this as something that, I should get behind this because it's helping students who were unfairly treated during the protests last spring. And so I think that usually you can see that people who may have had differences of opinion about the protests last spring may also have been, less inclined to vote yes on it.
So just to kind of wrap up the discussion, because we're running out of time, according to Yale Daily News, Dean Pericles Lewis expressed support generally for the idea of the police advisory board. I don't think he endorsed the specific proposal as much as the general concept. Is that a surprise? Is the outcome of this a surprise to any of you guys?
I would say I would be surprised if the direct YCC proposal was implemented at a broad level, just because I don't think that it's obviously clear enough to be like an actual university policy. I think they would have to do some serious remodeling in order for it to be a total university policy. But I think I am less surprised that, the administration would be interested in bringing some sort of advisory element to the police department.
David?
Agree completely. Would be surprised if they implemented these exact measures, but wouldn't be surprised if they decide to incorporate some sort of advisory board, which I would definitely support.
Josh, you want to take us home?
Sure, I definitely agree. I think it would be good for the campus to have a better relationship with the police department. I think an advisory relationship building board could be a step to do that. I would also hope that the university considers other ways of increasing student interaction, positive interaction with the Yale Police Department, to build like community policing policies, whether that's meet and greets or some other kind of like events to bring YPD officers and students together. I'd encourage Dean Lewis and the rest of the Yale administration to figure out how to humanize the YPD officers in the eyes of the students.
So not just overseeing the police, but also, I guess, not just a negative approach to the police, a positive one as well.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much, Will, David, Josh. I appreciate you joining us on Pod and Man at Yale.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, Ari.
What are your thoughts? Should undergrads have oversight of the police? Comment on our YouTube or email us at info@buckleyinstitute.com. And now on to our interview with Manhattan Institute's Rafael Mangual, criminal justice expert and a member of the Council on Criminal Justice. Rafael Mangual is the Nick O'Neill Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor at City Journal, and a member of the Council on Criminal Justice. His first book, Criminal Injustice, was released in July 2022. He's spoken to Buckley in the past on the practical limits of police reform, which I encourage everyone listening to check out on our YouTube channel. Rafael, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first, I want to talk about crime in New Haven, which is crime is your area of expertise. So going to one assessment I saw, New Haven has a crime rate of 46.6 crimes per 1,000 residents. 5.5 3/4 of those are violent. A little under 41 of those per 1,000 residents. Property crimes. So that makes Yale, according to that estimate, or New Haven, only safer than about 3% of U.S. cities, or less safe than 97% of them. So the Yale itself is like a fairly safe zone within a more dangerous New Haven. But why are cities like New Haven so dangerous? Like, what do they do that makes them more dangerous than suburban or rural areas?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it's what do they do as much as it is what don't they do. One of the things that we've learned over the last, half century is that crime is a static social problem that every jurisdiction is going to deal with at some level or another. But it's one that, doesn't have to exist at such high rates. There are things that cities can do to stem the tide of rising crime, proactive policing, more intelligence-driven policing, right? Deploying resources in response to particular problems, prosecuting in a way that is aiming to incapacitate the most high-rate offenders in the jurisdiction. I mean, these are the sort of things that allowed New York City, for example, to go from 2,262 murders in 1990 to 292 murders in 2017. So whenever I see, a city struggling with crime, I very rarely ask, what is the city doing to cause this? It's usually, what isn't the city doing, to get to where, things are a little easier for residents. Now, I can't claim intimate familiarity with the inner workings of New Haven, Connecticut, but my guess is that they're leaving some money on the table in the policing and criminal justice policy arena. And that's not, unique to New Haven, unfortunately. Lots of cities, particularly since 2020, but, really since 2013, 14, have kind of been moving in this direction. But if your question was getting at, the broader question of why do cities tend to see so much crime, I do think it's just worth noting that urban environments are just, more conducive to the kinds of crimes that we often see and hear about, things like robbery and burglary and, car theft and grand larceny and assault and homicide. Cities provide, an abundance of potential targets, right? You have, vulnerable people gathering together in high numbers. Cities, through their larger populations and more dense populations, offer greater sense of anonymity, which allows people to get away with crimes at rates that they wouldn't be able to do in a small town, right? I mean, if you commit a homicide in a town of, 5,000 people, that's usually like 10 people that they know,
They know
crime
who-
suspects, and someone probably saw you do it, or could vouch.
I
or
remember
vouch.
the town I grew up in, not a small town, but like a nice suburban neighborhood. They had, like, the first murder in 10 years, and it was like the biggest news, right? Things like
Yeah, yeah. So, it's urban environments, there's a theory of crime I subscribe to, which is called the routine activities theory of crime. And it posits that, for crime to flourish, you need three things. One is a presence of motivated offenders, right? And in a big city, you're going to have, no shortage of people who, are looking to commit crimes. But you also need the presence of vulnerable targets, right? So people who, are in situations where they're either outnumbered or perhaps weaker, or not quite paying attention. But you also need what's called an absence of capable guardians. Now, capable guardians, the most obvious form that takes is police. The most visible form that takes is police, but it can mean other eyes on the street, other citizens, right? The sort of Daniel Penny types, capable men who might step in. It could mean a CCTV camera, anything that might deter you,
Right.
by signaling that, someone with authority is in charge of the space that you're in.
So this discussion kind of calls to mind my own college experience. I went to college down in Baltimore, and where I went, it was kind of on the edge of, like, I went to Johns Hopkins. There's a really nice neighborhood to the north of us, and a very dangerous neighborhood to the east and south of us, and kind of an in-between neighborhood to the west. And I would talk to friends who went to other schools that were also in, dangerous neighborhoods or crime-ridden neighborhoods. What is it about college towns or college neighborhoods of cities that are, seem to be more prone to crime?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know if I have an answer that's better than a guess, but my best guess would be that it has something to do with the fact that this kind of space that you need to build out a college campus is going to be more available in parts of a city that are where the population is a little more dispersed. And those actually tend to be the parts of the city that are a little more vulnerable to high levels of crime. So if you were to, I actually did this once for Chicago, if you were to overlay a population density map in Chicago with a map of where shootings occur, what you would find is that the vast majority of the shootings occur in the least densely populated parts of the city. And one of the reasons for that is that, while, urban environments need to provide, a number of vulnerable targets, you also need to be able to get away with crimes. And, when it comes to more serious crimes like shootings, carjackings, armed robberies, and aggravated assaults, you need a getaway. And getaways are particularly difficult in really dense urban centers where there's a lot of traffic, where there are a lot of potential witnesses. And when I think about some of the college campuses you mentioned, these are situated in parts of the city where, the population isn't super dense, where there isn't a massive, kind of collection of businesses that, have CCTV cameras and have a lot of foot traffic and, eyes on the street and that sort of thing. So I think it's more coincidence than anything else. But there is I also think, a degree to which college students often, constitute the kind of vulnerable targets that, criminal opportunists are going to seek out, right? I mean, the thought is, right, if you're, going to Johns Hopkins, the jump out boys in Baltimore think like, okay, well, these are kids whose parents have money, right? So they're all going to have iPhones that we can steal, or they're going to, you know, so I think it's a combination of opportunity, but also just, the built environmental, sort of, I guess, upside for criminals who are looking to take advantage.
College students, whether at Yale, Hopkins, Chicago, they're, not necessarily plugged in to, what's going on. They're not very dedicated because they're only around a few months at a time. They probably don't take care of their, put in the security features that you need to do to deter crime. So they, in a sense, they make themselves more vulnerable.
Look, it's like, you're more likely to find somebody stumbling home from the bar with their headphones on, not quite paying attention, and not quite able to walk a straight line in a college town than you would, maybe in another part of the city. And so, criminals often look for soft targets, and I think that's certainly part of it.
So when you were talking about the first question, you talked about the things that cities don't do to make their neighborhood less safe. What drives that, right? What's the thing? Like, what is it? Just budget constraints? Is it capacity? We've seen in some cases it's ideology. What are the kind of factors that push a city to make those decisions?
I think it's a combination of ideology and resource constraints, but I think a lot of the resource constraints are actually driven by ideological capture. So one of the strategies of the far left in particular when it comes to issues like policing and criminal justice has been kind of a starve the beast strategy, right? It's like, we don't like the criminal justice system the way it operates. We don't like the institution of policing the way that it operates. So we're going to deprive it of resources. The most extreme form that this took in recent history was, of course, the defund the police movement. But you see it in less obvious forms, right? You have things like unfunded compliance burdens, on police and prosecutors. You have the election of progressive prosecutors who, divert resources from kind of traditional law enforcement measures into things like diversion programs. And, you have, jail budgets that, are consistently sold short. And, in the case of New York City, you have the move to close Rikers Island, which is our massive jail complex on a small island off the coast of Queens, that is now going to be replaced with a system whose capacity is 3,300 beds, which, by contrast, in the 90s, New York City's jail population exceeded 20,000. And so, to cut, maximum capacity by that much, it's a design, right? It's a feature, not a bug for them. So, a lot of the resource constraints are often created by people who share this ideology. And the ideology is really, rooted in a fundamental disagreement with the idea that a functioning civil society requires institutions of law enforcement to flourish. I think that's true. Police abolitionists, the most kind of extreme criminal justice reformers, don't. In their minds, crime is a social problem that we can essentially spend our way out of. And if we spend the money that we spend on policing and prosecution and incarceration on things like education and social programs, community centers, that we would eliminate predation and we would eliminate, the perceived need to offend on the part of criminals, and we could, sort of get at public safety that way. I think that's fantastical thinking. I think it's also the height of hubris because it suggests that, these are the people who have an answer to society's most intractable problems, right? I mean, there has never existed a human society throughout the entire course of history anywhere in the world that has been crime-free, that has been poverty-free, that has been inequality-free. So these are things that I think, criminal realists like myself, understand as, problems that are going to exist, and you need to create the infrastructure to deal with them adequately.
One of your colleagues, Rob Henderson, has this idea called luxury beliefs, where, basic concept that people hold ideas, and like he largely identifies as progressives, but there are some conservative ideals also, but they hold ideas that work in kind of their small bubble, the vacuum, but hurt people who aren't kind of protected in the way they are protected from the consequences. He talks about their single motherhood in this way, or, being single motherhood is great if you're an upper middle income white woman, or, not even white woman, upper middle income person. But like if you're poor and in a poor part of the neighborhood with no education, it's terrible to be a single mother. When it comes to crime, it's the same kind of thing. Like defund the police because I live in a nice, wealthy neighborhood, so I'm not worried. But it hurts the people who are in poor neighborhoods who aren't safe. So how does is that kind of what we're talking about here? Is it a divorce from the consequences of their actions?
I think that has something to do with it. Absolutely. I mean, crime, is an incredibly hyper concentrated phenomenon, right? It's not at all evenly distributed throughout, any jurisdiction that you look at. So in New York City, for example, I'm mentioning a lot of New York City statistics, but that's where so, I can't help myself. But so in New York City, we have about 83,000 street segments. A street segment, for those who don't know, if you think of a city block, a street segment would be corner to corner, both sidewalks. So that's like one street segment. In New York City, we have 83,000 of them, but only 3.5% of all of our street segments see 50% of all violent crime. And just 1% of the street segments see 25% of all violent crime. If you look at a city like Chicago, just so I can add a little geographical diversity here, and you look at the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in that city, you would see that they had in 2019 a collective homicide rate in excess of 61 per 100,000. That was a year in which the national homicide rate was 5 per 100,000. If you looked at the 10 safest neighborhoods in that city that year, you would see a collective homicide rate just over 1 per 100,000. Right, so 1 per 100,000 versus 61 per 100,000, and the 61 actually understates just how dangerous some of the neighborhoods in that collection are. I mean, you take a place like West Garfield Park, and you'll find that in 2019 that neighborhood had a homicide rate of 131 per 100,000. And of course, there's demographic concentration too, right? In those 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago, the population is about 95% Black and Hispanic. In New York City, if you look at, different crime categories, take shooting victims, for example, about 95% of all shooting victims are going to be either Black or Hispanic in a given year. So, for a lot of the people doing the policy advocacy, there is a real sort of degree of removal from the core of the problem. And so I think you're right to, suggest that we should take note of the fact that a lot of the people offering the most extreme kind of reforms don't stand, to pay any of the price should things go south, right? They have no skin in the game. And so that's a component of the luxury beliefs thing. But there's also this kind of implicit recognition that, because you have to assume that they would never back a policy that they genuinely believed would make their lives worse. And since they genuinely, but at least we assume that they genuinely believe that their lives are not going to be made worse off, there's kind of an implicit recognition of the fact that crime is actually driven by people. They understand that the people in the neighborhoods that they live in are not suddenly going to become predators simply because you defunded the police there, right? And that was kind of one of my gripes with how people were talking about police and criminal justice reform in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020. But the reality is that you can upend criminal justice policy at the state level, and most communities in that state are not going to see a difference because most communities don't have that sort of critical mass of criminal offenders that are suddenly going to take advantage. Where things are going to matter, where the rubber is going to meet the road, is in those discrete places where crime concentrates. And in those places, it's going to be an absolute disaster. And I think that's how things have played out across the country since, kind of the height of the, criminal justice reform movement in 2020 and 21.
I mean, a lot of that was at least supported or, pushed by college students, right? Your college students at Yale are supportive, things like that. So where does, do you think that like the college student out there protesting to defund the police, does that fit within that rubric? Are they also, just getting in on this movement? Are they trying to get a moment in the sun, or do they really do they also fill within that we are safe so we can support these policies kind of perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's a conscious thing. I think college students generally have been throughout history kind of, idealists who want to feel like they're doing something for the world. And, especially when you're talking about students that are, being educated at elite institutions like Yale, I think there's a tendency to feel even more, a deeper sense of self-importance and righteousness. Well, it's understandable, right? I mean,
Right.
you're talking about kids who have had everyone in their lives telling them how brilliant they are because they are,
Mhm.
for, the 17, 18 years that they've been on Earth. But despite that brilliance and despite their incredible capacity to learn, they don't actually really know anything yet.
Mhm.
So they have this kind of, young person's hubris combined with the, very typical sense of indestructibility. And so, yeah, it's not surprising that a lot of the support for this, comes from college campuses. But, I do think it's worth making clear that at the end of the day, the adults in the room are always responsible for what happens. And, the college campus population is not big enough to drive political change at that level. And so, the sad reality is that alongside, misguided, 18-year-olds, were a lot of adults who should have known better, calling for exactly the same things. And that's why we got to where we got.
So at Yale, we kind of have, I guess, what I see as like a recent iteration of that. Yale student government recently passed a resolution calling for the creation of a Yale Police Oversight Board. A previous iteration had existed and was shut down during the encampments last year. So their board will have 2 undergrads, 2 grad students, 5 faculty members. They want to be able to review any police department partnerships with state or federal agencies. They want the power to review Yale Police Department surveillance practices and use of force policies. So I guess there's 2 questions here. Obviously, there's the more broad questions. Do you think there's value to police oversight board? The town level, the city level, they're not new. And then the secondary question, right? Do you think giving students, undergrads, graduate students, even faculty members, the kind of power that they're looking for is a good idea?
Well, I'll start with the last question first because it's an easy one, and the answer to that is no. I don't think it's a good idea. But it's funny. I mean, even just the way that question's framed, it's like there's this assumption on the part of so many people that, if it weren't for activists, police would be operating in this world in which they have impunity. And it's never the case. There is no world in which police operate without any oversight, right? Police departments are headed by an executive, and that executive oversees, what the officers and the rank and file are doing, and even, the senior executive officers and how they're managing the rank and file officers. And that police executive usually, answers to a mayor. And that mayor is overseeing the department and having to answer politically for, what goes wrong and right within that department. And, that mayor is, of course, answering to the voters. And, the police department isn't operating in a vacuum. It's operating, in the shadow of a legal infrastructure that is driven by a city council and a state legislature and a governor. And, police are subject to the same criminal laws that we're all subjected to. They're subject to civil suits, and there's no shortage of that in any jurisdiction in the world. So it's like I always ask people who say police need more oversight. It's like, where is the lack of oversight? And I never really get a good answer. I mean,
Is it
the
just kind
reality,
of perception pushed in like the media with like, recent discussions about
yeah.
it, or?
It's a misperception pushed by the media because it's meant to facilitate kind of more power grabs like the ones that you just described. I mean, there's no reason to believe that a handful of students and faculty members at Yale, as great a university as it is, are well positioned to direct or redirect the decisions being made by professional police. And Yeah. So, I think ultimately it's just a reflection of this same kind of ideological posture that stands in opposition to traditional institutions of law enforcement. And a lot of that comes down to the race issue, which I don't think you can tiptoe around. I think ultimately a lot of the ideological opposition to policing and, broader institutions of criminal justice is really rooted in what are seen as unjustifiable disparities in enforcement. You hear it, and you can't have a debate about policing or prosecution or incarceration for more than 5 minutes before the race issue comes up. And so, I think ultimately that's what this comes down to at its core. But I think for the people, who see this issue through that race lens, fail to do is recognize the racial imbalance in terms of the victimization costs, right? The criminal victimization costs. I think they fail to see the racial imbalance with respect to the distribution of the benefits associated with traditional institutions of law enforcement, right? Ask even, the most left-wing but honest, criminologists in this country, and they'll have to admit, if pressed, that one of the most consistent and robust findings in the criminological literature is that policing reduces crime. The most recent estimates I saw was that for every police officer hired, you abate 0.1 homicides per year, meaning that for every 10 officers you hire, you save one life per year. Those benefits that are driven primarily by reductions in the most serious kinds of crimes are not evenly distributed. We've seen that throughout history. We've seen that more recently. The study that I just mentioned found that the effects were twice as large in Black neighborhoods as they were in white ones. If you look at the homicide decline between 1990 and 2014, which was something that police were in large part, although not exclusively, responsible for, that decline added 0.1 years of life expectancy to the average white man's life, which is not nothing. That's a meaningful boost, but it added a full year of life expectancy to the average Black man's life.
Wow.
And that's from a study done by a very, kind of left of center scholar named Patrick Sharkey, who was at NYU, is now at Princeton, I believe. But we know now who is going to benefit from the kinds of efforts that police engage in that have been studied and shown to reduce crime. And if you ask police executives what it is that they're after, 9 out of 10 are going to tell you that they want to control crime, that that's their main motivation.
Right.
And given that we now know very clearly, without a shadow of a doubt, that the primary beneficiaries of those efforts are going to be, Black and brown, mostly men, the question becomes, why on earth would an institution that's allegedly designed and operated for the specific oppression of those groups so disproportionately benefit those groups when the system achieves its stated ends? And that's a question that I've never really gotten a good answer to.
It calls to mind something you said earlier about how a lot of the crime is really concentrated in very small parts of dangerous cities, and oftentimes those neighborhoods are majority Hispanic or Black. So, when you talk about the number of homicides prevented, you're really talking about homicides and victimization of Black and Hispanic people, right?
Exactly.
So even if they are also, disproportionately subject to police enforcement, they're also disproportionately protected by police enforcement.
That's exactly right.
So I do want to, kind of come back to the Yale situation, because there's a little factoid about this that I found very interesting, and I thought highlighted it for me, like what my concerns were overall. One of the lone undergraduate representative to the student board, to the oversight board that was shut down in 2024, was actually arrested twice for trespassing during the encampments. So for me, it kind of crystallized the concerns, how much maybe this is less about the general goals of policing or oversight of policing as much as students who want to be able to protest and vandalize things, trespass without consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good guess. It seems reasonable to me, given that factoid that you just mentioned. Yeah, look, again, I think a lot of the opposition, is fundamental in nature, which is to say that, these efforts are usually driven by people who just fundamentally disagree with either the existence or at least the current posture of institutions like the Yale Police Department, or any other police department for that matter. And so, there are a couple ways that you could go about limiting the power of those institutions. You can, cut their budgets, as lots of places try to do. You could legislatively limit their authority, or administratively limit their authority through executive action. We've seen that in cities around the country, taking the form of things like, bans on certain kinds of police pursuits and, limits on the racial breakdowns of things like enforcement actions like pedestrian stops. But you could also, create these oversight infrastructures that are really just meant to frustrate the efforts of the departments in question. And we've seen it with civilian complaint review boards in cities across the country, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and so it's not at all surprising that we're seeing this step taken in a place like Yale.
I could talk about this for, forever, but we are running out of time. So I do want to wrap up with the usual Buckley Institute question we have for all of our expert interviews. What impact has Buckley had on your life through National Review, Firing Line, reading his books? How has Bill Buckley himself, made an impact on you?
Yeah, so Firing Line was actually really important for me. So when I was, I want to say, a sophomore in college, we all got free Amazon Prime accounts as as students. And at the time, Amazon Prime had the whole cache of episodes of Firing Line. And so when I logged on to my Prime Video homepage, I got a little suggestion of a video to watch. And it was a debate between William F. Buckley and Noam Chomsky on the Vietnam War on Firing Line on PBS. And I don't know what compelled me to click on this, because I was not, particularly political at the time. But I clicked on it and I watched them engage. And I, within like a month, I had seen every single episode of Firing Line. And that was how I discovered, so many thinkers, including and especially Thomas Sowell, and went down that rabbit hole. So, Firing Line actually, I think, was primarily responsible in a way for my right of center political disposition now. I think that got me started in an interesting way. And, really what appealed to me most about it was how, it was an exhibition of something that I was hungry for, which was to say that, I was hungry for exposure to informed, robust debate. And I wasn't getting that in college. I was only ever getting one side of things. And I didn't know how much I was, unhappy with that model until I had been exposed to, what a more balanced approach could look like. And the rest is history, as they say.
I appreciate that. That's an incredible story. I just want to thank you so much for your time, and thanks for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale.
Thank you so much for having me.
That wraps up another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale. Send us your thoughts on the new Police Advisory Board, either by commenting on YouTube or emailing us at info@buckleyinstitute.com. And always remember, for God, for country, and for Yale, in that order.